Mussolini is where? Africa? How come? Ah, yes, the triumphant march into Cairo. You do realize Rommel hasn't gotten to Cairo yet. Yeah, he's counting his chickens before they hatch. What? No, I don't know if that's also an Italian expression, actually. That is a very interesting question. All right. July 3rd, 1942. The Axis powers invaded the Soviet Union last June. And 371 days later, they launch another huge offensive there. This week is the beginning of Fall Blau. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Germans crossed the border into Egypt, ready to attack the Allies once again. The Germans attacked the Soviets with Operation Friedrichsruhe, and Joseph Stalin refused to believe the intelligence he's gotten that says the big German summer offensive is going to not aim for Moscow, but will attack against the south towards the Caucasus. But that offensive, Fall Blau, case or Operation Blue, does indeed begin this week on the 28th. Phase 1 begins with a short artillery bombardment and Luftwaffe airstrike. Then at 10 a.m., Army Group Vikes, a temporary formation, attacks in the north of the region towards Voronezh. The German 2nd Army on the left, the German 4th Panzer Army on the right, and the Hungarian infantry covering the flank. They break through both immediately and everywhere. This comes as a bit of a surprise to those units, but as we saw, Joseph Stalin, much like last year, has chosen to ignore all the intelligence reports from within and from his Western allies, and even captured ones from the Germans telling him that this attack is coming. And he's been fixated on the mistaken idea that it would be towards Moscow. That and the local German offensives recently further south have the Soviets completely back-footed here. The German field commanders sure didn't expect the resistance to be so feeble. This was, after all, a breakthrough battle from a standing start, without the great strategic surprise of Barbarossa. That had been a bolt out of the blue that literally caught the defenders napping. Blue, they had felt, was going to require some tough fighting at the outset, before the panzer divisions reached open ground for operational level maneuver. Vikes' armor is the northern thrust of a planned double envelopment of the Soviet 40th Army on the left of the Soviet Bryansk front and the 21st Army on the southwestern front's right. The spearheads of the 4th Panzers advanced nearly 50 kilometers on day one, crossing 2 rivers and cutting the link between the 13th and 40th Armies. The next day in the driving rain, Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzers take 40th Army headquarters, and the 40th Command loses contact with its divisions. That army defends north and south of Tim, and their breaking puts the entire center of the Bryansk front in danger west of Livny, and the 21st Army west of Stary and Novi Oskol, who are also opposite Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army. That German army plans to hit the Soviets between the 21st and 28th Armies, force the 28th south, and then complete the surrounding of the 21st and 40th to the north. They are also supposed to start moving the 28th, but the rains have wrecked the ground so bad, Paulus doesn't get going until the 30th. But he just crashes right through the Soviet 21st Army. With the 40th Panzer Corps leading the way, they reach the Oskol River by the afternoon of the 1st, and on the 2nd, make contact with the 4th Panzers 40 kilometers east of Stary Oskol. By this time, Stavka has ordered Bryansk and Southwestern Front commanders Philip Golikov and Semyon Timoshenko to withdraw the 40th, 21st, and 28th Armies. But that order is difficult, if not impossible, to get to most of the troops in the field, and disaster looms. Most of the 28th does manage to withdraw to the Oskol River, but it's no longer strong enough to make a defense there. Paulus crosses the Oskol and takes Novi Oskol as the week ends. Much of the 40th, in small groups of various sizes, does manage to escape east through gaps in the German positions. But even at the brigade level, it no longer exists as an organized combat formation. The 21st batters its way to the Oskol and tries to escape through the gap between Vikes and Paulus's spearheads. But like the 40th, it loses over half its men and equipment and is no longer a viable fighting force. There is now a huge gap between the two Soviet fronts. And should the enemy reach Voronezh, they'll cut the rail link between Moscow and the south, wrecking Soviet strategic troop movements. German Army Group South Commander Fedor von Bock, in overall charge, tells Hoth I, straight for Voronezh, don't look left or right. The Soviets are trying to defend on the Great Steppe, which has no trees and few roads and no natural obstacles. It's basically a sea of grass, and there is nowhere to really make any defenses, and it is perfect for armored units such as Hoth's. Bock grows worried by the end of the week, though, that his forces might be hit in the flanks or the rear in phase 2 of the operation when they head south down the inter-river corridor between the Donets and the Don by Soviet forces operating from beyond Voronezh. So he wants Hoth's 4th Panzer Army to take that city, but to maybe leave Paulus's 6th Army to head down the corridor alone with no armor support. And then when they get to the Don River bend, they jump across to the Volga and Stalingrad, which they'd take and hold as a blocking point, which would prevent any other attacks from the Soviet interior hitting the main force when it went in behind the 6th to the Caucasus. Adolf Hitler flies to see Bock today at the end of the week. He's been directing things from Rastenburg, well over 1,000 kilometers away from the front. He thinks Bock is going to waste time and tanks in the fighting for Voronezh. But Bock assures him he will not use his striking force there in close combat. That is the totally abridged version of something way more complicated and more involved, something that's really a big deal, but something I'll talk a lot about next week and get to the bottom of. Further south, all of the Crimea is now in Axis hands as Sevastopol is ordered evacuated by the Soviets the 30th and then overrun the following days. 90,000 Soviet prisoners are taken and Erich von Manstein is promoted to field marshal. The Axis also now hold all of Cyrenaica in North Africa and are trying to make it into Egypt as well. The German 90th Light Division has scattered the units in the Allied center as the week begins and bypasses Mersa Matruh, aiming to cut the coastal road some way to the east of it, but they're halted by elements of the 50th Division. The DAK is also stopped along the southern escarpment parallel to the coast. So Axis Commander Erwin Rommel finds himself suddenly strung out between two substantial corps and is really vulnerable for the moment. Yet again, the failure of the British command to obtain reliable and up-to-date information led to an incoherent action or series of actions. See, the morning of the 27th, Theater Commander Claude Auchinleck orders Operation Pike to begin, the withdrawal of the 10th and 13th Corps to the Fuka-Minkar-Omar line, if they think they cannot maintain a coherent front. Well, when it seems like the enemy might surround the New Zealanders and split 13th Corps, Corps Commander William Gott does this that night, also ordering the 1st Armored Division to fall back. He is following orders to avoid formations becoming isolated, so the 1st Armored stops at Fuka the morning of the 28th. But the New Zealanders, who do manage to fight their way out, though their commander Bernhard Freiberg is injured, head all the way to El Alamein, the designated next stage of withdrawal. But communications failure means that William Holz's 10th Corps doesn't know any of this and continues his counterattack on Rommel's flank. And when the coast road is cut, he's temporarily cut off from the rest of 8th Army. On the 28th, Holmes gets the order to pull back that night, covered by 13th Corps. At pretty much exactly the same time, he learns that 13th Corps has already gone. Holmes does manage to make it out anyhow, and everybody has to now head to El Alamein because the enemy has taken Mersa Matruh and pushed on to Fuka. Lieutenant General Holmes and his headquarters had to run the gauntlet just like every other unit, bursting their way forward through groups of Germans and Italians. Their passage became even worse at Fuka, where the enemy were already engaged by the rear guard of 13th Corps. At El Daba, there was no time to regroup, for by then, all of 8th Army was on the move, trying to get back into some sort of refuge at El Alamein. Auchinleck organizes his forces there. 30th Corps to hold the north sector, 13th Corps the south, 1st and 7th Armored Divisions are held back and readied, and 10th Corps is sent to set up defenses in the Nile Delta should the Axis break through. Well, it is the 28th that Rommel takes Mersa Matruh, lots of supplies, and 6,000 prisoners. He is now 100 kilometers west of Alexandria. Italian leader Benito Mussolini has come to Africa so he can triumphantly enter Cairo as a great conqueror when it falls. Mersa Matruh is another big coup for Rommel, winning again despite being outnumbered. But again, British communication issues breaking down means that once again, brigades and divisions end up fighting individual battles. Having said that, 8th Army is still intact and now at El Alamein has a solid front for the first time since Gazala. Rommel reaches El Alamein the 30th and thinks if he can take it, then the whole Nile Delta will be his. And he is driving his troops on without rest. Obviously, the longer the Allies stay at El Alamein, the harder it will be to get them out. On the 1st, Rommel tries to do what he did at Mersa Matruh and sends the 90th Light through the center to cut the road to the east while the DAK swings around to the south. But this time, 30th and 13th Corps stop the attacks. Attacks fail again on the 2nd, and by the 3rd, the DAK has but 26 operational tanks. That same day, the Italian Ariete Division is nearly wiped out by the New Zealanders. Rommel realizes he must rest and regroup, reporting home that he expects to be on the defensive for at least 2 weeks. Mussolini returns to Italy. But he's not the only leader flying around making plans for conquest. Let's look over to the US for a minute. The American victory at Midway a few weeks ago has obviously changed the nature of the Pacific War in several ways. And one of them is that the Allies can go over to the offensive. The question is, along which route will they try to advance to reach the ultimate goal of the Japanese home islands, from the bases in Australia or those in Hawaii, both of which are thousands of kilometers away from the goal? Is it better to try to hop along the big islands of the East Indies or the tiny atolls of the North Pacific? Choosing the northern route would make Chester Nimitz top dog, since he commands the Pacific Fleet from Hawaii, and he's in charge of the Pacific Ocean area under the division we saw March 30th. The problem with that choice is that the Marine Corps is the only military arm under the Navy Department, and at the moment it's pretty small. And anyway, also at the moment, the Navy lacks the shipping like fast oilers and transports, the warships, and the men to walk the atolls to Japan. The Army, under Douglas MacArthur's command, who is also in charge of the southwestern Pacific area, has the men all right. They're being shipped all the time to Australia from training camp. And that southern route starts pretty close to Australia and, importantly, runs along big islands that are bound to have at least some of the resources that an army needs. They'll also need fewer shipping resources. But doing that would put MacArthur and the army in charge. And though he is an American public hero after Bataan, he's not at all popular with the admirals of the Navy. Through stormy inter-service negotiations, a compromise was reached. The services would take the southern route, but the area would be subdivided to allot part of the theater to Nimitz and the Navy, part to MacArthur and the Army, which would have strictly limited call on the Navy's transports, carriers, and bombardment fleet. The compromise, agreed on July 2nd, 1942, consigned Task 1, the capture of the island of Guadalcanal, east of New Guinea, to the Navy. Task 2, an advance into New Guinea and its offshore island of New Britain, where Japan had a major base at Rabaul, would go to MacArthur, so eventually would Task 3, a final assault on Rabaul. Task 1, more specifically, starts with the capture of the Santa Cruz Islands as a preliminary for attacking Tulagi. The compromise was agreed to last week by Ernest King and George Marshall, Navy and Army chiefs. Nimitz flies into San Francisco this week for the planned briefing, and he is pretty shaken by a close brush with death. The flying boat he arrives in capsizes upon landing, killing the pilot. Well, tomorrow the 4th is the briefing, and there it will be revealed from hypo intelligence that the Japanese are quickly building an airfield on Guadalcanal, which would seriously threaten the approaches to Australia. So the Santa Cruz plan will be scrapped, and instead they will launch attacks on Tulagi and Guadalcanal by August 1st. But there is a lot of naval and shipping news this week. On the 27th, shipping convoy PQ-17 sails from Iceland, 35 merchant ships and 3 passenger ships that have been refitted for rescuing the crews of torpedoed ships. There's also a tanker and 6 destroyers and 13 smaller ships as close escort. They're heading for Archangel. Also, convoy QP-13 leaves Archangel and Murmansk this day on the return journey. On the 28th, from Scapa Flow, ships of the British Home Fleet give distant cover for PQ-17. Battleships Duke of York and Washington, carrier Victorious, and cruisers and destroyers. On July 1st, QP-17 is spotted by 2 U-boats. 8 more join the hunt. The next day, the 2 convoys pass each other. Sightings of the 2 of them then caused some confusion to the Germans. Air and submarine attacks on PQ-17 are not successful, but battleship Tirpitz, heavy cruiser Hipper, and 6 destroyers leave Trondheim base to help the hunt. The next day, battlecruiser and pocket battleship Lutzow and Admiral Scheer leave Narvik to join Tirpitz, but Lutzow and 3 destroyers run aground. There is naught but foreboding in northern Atlantic waters as the week ends. But here are the Battle of the Atlantic totals for the month of June 1942. The Allies lose 173 ships of 834,200 tons. Of that, 144 ships for 700,200 tons are sunk by U-boats. There are around a dozen U-boats in and around the Caribbean and several more off Brazilian waters. And that will end the week. A week that cannot help but be defined by the Germans launching a big offensive in the Soviet Union that again surprises the Soviets. Rommel advances further in North Africa but is stopped by the end of the week, and a huge convoy is in great danger in northern waters. Oh, and on the 2nd, in the House of Commons, comes a motion of censure on Churchill's direction of the war, but it is defeated 476 to 25. The principal criticism is that Churchill has too heavy a burden with the conduct of the war and the business of the government both being his direct responsibility. Churchill's reply is that Parliament should either change the government or support it, but should not meddle with its composition. The Axis are really on the move once again in the USSR. We sure saw that last summer, but eventually they could not overcome in 1941 the 2 great Soviet advantages: endless land and endless men. One would imagine also that the Soviets fighting in 1942 are now a whole lot more experienced, and one knows for a fact that the German army is not the same force that attacked last year, is attacking from points a lot further from home, and has big logistical issues just going into the battle. On the other hand, the attacks this week were spectacularly successful, and if they can succeed in cutting the Soviets off from their resources in the Caucasus, maybe none of that will matter in the long run. I guess only time will tell. Over on the Time Ghost History channel, we're currently doing Between Two Wars Season 2, and one recent episode has to do with Mussolini playing fast and loose with some historical facts, in the name of triumph, of course. You can check that out right here. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Isak Itroy. Join the army in its own triumphal march through history at patreon.com or timeghost.tv and help us continue to make all of this magic. And do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.